Welcome to this evening's program, Heaven on the Half Shell, Washington State's Oyster Odyssey, a presentation by David George Gordon, brought to you by the North Olympic Library System and Humanities Washington. We begin by acknowledging that the lands on which we live and gather are the appropriated homelands of Indigenous peoples. We want to express our deepest respect to those peoples, past and present, for their care of these lands throughout the generations. The North Olympic Library System serves all of Clallam County with locations in Clallam Bay, Forks, Port Angeles, and Esquim, and the Knowles Bookmobile. To learn more about what is happening at your library, please visit our website at nols.org. This evening's presentation is part of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking. They bring cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout the state of Washington each year, thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors. The Speakers Bureau program is designed to generate open and honest conversation. The intention is for this program to be a safe and inclusive space where differing perspectives and viewpoints are encouraged and shared in a respectful manner. You can find information about other events like this one on the Humanities Washington website at humanities.org. After this presentation, you'll receive an email with a link to a brief evaluation from Humanities Washington. Please consider taking just a few moments to complete the evaluation to support them and their efforts to continually improve their Speakers Bureau programs. We are very happy to have David George Gordon here with us this evening to talk about Washington State's beloved bivalve, the oyster. David George Gordon is the principal author of Heaven on the Half Shell, The Story of the Oyster in the Pacific Northwest. A former science writer for Washington Sea Grant, Gordon has written 22 books on topics ranging from slugs and snails to sharks, gray whales, and Sasquatch. And several of these titles are available in the Knowles collection. So welcome, David. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. This is great. All right. I like it. Thank you. I'm going to take a moment and hit the button for share so I can start my slideshow, and we'll take it from there. All right. That looks like it worked. Did that work? Thumbs up? Yes. All right. Well, as we just heard, I'm one of the Humanities Washington speakers. There are probably about 30 of us currently, and I have a 2-year stint, in this case, speaking about my most recent book, Heaven on the Half Shell. And there's the book itself. Now, I do want to say I've actually wrote this book 20 some years ago. It was actually published on, believe it or not, the actual date 9/11. So at the time it came out, people were in kind of distracted at that point, and they weren't that interested in reading about oysters. So they actually delayed the release of the book by about 6 months. Then they released it. I think it came out in 2001. And 20 years had passed, and I went, there's lots of stuff that's not in this book. It's time to update it. We were lucky to find a good partner, the University of Washington Press, to publish this book. And now this book and maybe the earlier edition are both available through the North Olympic Library programs on request. So I'm going to talk to you today about a subject very close to my heart, But before I get into that, I want to give you a little bit of my own background. I have written 22 books, which sounds like a lot, but it all went by in a blink of an eye. So we don't know for sure what I'm going to work on next, but I bet it'll be a doozy. The book that got me started with Humanities Washington, I'm sorry, hold on a moment. There is the Eat a Bug Cookbook. I wrote this book in 1998. So right around the time I was getting ready to write the Heaven on the Hatchall book, this book contains 40 recipes for everything from little tiny termites and ants all the way up to big tarantula spiders that are like the size of my hand. And yes, I have tried them all. You can't write a cookbook without trying your own recipes. That would be against the law. Uh, After this book came out, I kind of became a household word for this topic. I was on lots of TV shows, Conan O'Brien, and more recently, the James Corden show. It was a wild ride, and the book is no longer in print, but might be available through your library and certainly available online through Amazon or any of those online booksellers. The more recent book that I wrote is the Sasquatch Seeker's Field Manual. This is a book that tells you what to do if you actually see or hear or smell a Sasquatch, how to record your findings so that it's more likely to be accepted by scientists as legit. So this is a good book for young people who have a natural curiosity, but definitely want to share their findings with others. And I hope you would enjoy it. Okay, now, I'm sorry, I'm just fiddling with connect. There we go. Okay, so this book, of course, is about oysters. I think unlike the Sasquatch, everyone was probably in this room is in agreement that oysters exist. And maybe like a minority of you that would believe that well, insects are decent food, a protein-rich source. So selling the idea of eating oysters on the half shell for me is a lot easier. And I'm fascinated with this. Like I said, I've put about 20 some years of research into writing this book. So you don't want to get caught at a cocktail party with me, or I'll talk your ear off about little known facts about oysters. This, by the way, is the earliest picture that I've found of Native Americans in Washington State harvesting shellfish. This picture was taken in the 1890s by the man who went on to become the first governor of Alaska, Governor Wickersham. And he was using a first generation Kodak camera, which explains why this is a circular image. That's what you got when you wanted to take a picture in those days. And I thought it's interesting that the posture of this person is bent down. They've obviously been doing this for a long time, and they know how to save their backs with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of amazing. I also want to take, before we get started, I want to say Washington currently leads the nation in shellfish production. And that's because we have really clean water. The state is a lot younger than some of the East Coast states, 100 years younger easily. And we haven't had that much time to mess things up. Fortunately, most of us are very protective of our water. If you like shellfish, you've got to like clean water. And a picture like this is not that uncommon. Thanks to all of you who are in the audience watching this program and doing your part to protect Puget Sound and the coastal waters where the oysters are likely to be found. The Strait of Juan de Fuca, for example, is a wonderful place to get oysters. And actually, that whole area around Squim and going west to Port Angeles, that's really prime shellfish growing habitat in Clallam County. So thank you all for doing your parts. I'll talk a little bit about this again towards the end of the program. By the way, if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat function of this Zoom so that we can answer them at the end of the program. I hope to answer most of your questions while I'm just giving this presentation. Okay, now I'm going to talk about several different kinds of oysters because we actually raise 5 different types, radically different types of oysters in Washington State. I'm going to talk about the most popular ones, and number 1 is the Olympia oyster. This is actually the only oyster in Washington that's native to Washington State. This was the shellfish that the indigenous people of Washington were harvesting, and actually had great interest in selling them to or trading them to other tribes. People would come as far as Yakima, Washington, to get oysters and other shellfish and bringing them home to their tribes. Kind of amazing. It was valuable real estate back then. This is actually a picture in the background is Hurricane Ridge and the Olympic Mountains. So this is definitely in somewhere along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. If you look closely at this picture, you'll see that beautiful dugout canoe that was carved from a single tree trunk. Kind of amazing. But also look around and you'll see all these small baskets in the low tide area. Those are actually special collecting baskets used by the indigenous people to harvest shellfish. One of those baskets, here's a nice picture of one called a clam basket or a shellfish basket. And this is actually in the Duwamish Museum in West Seattle on display. If you look at it, you'll see, though, that it's a very wide and open weave. The reason is people would harvest clams or oysters or other shellfish, cockles, and put them in there, and then they could actually set the whole basket in the tides. When the tide came in, it rinsed out a lot of the sand and silt and other stuff that came with the oysters or clams. And now it's kind of ready to go. You didn't have to have a separate process of cleaning the shellfish before they were eaten. So it's kind of an interesting invention. As it turns out, these baskets go back hundreds of years. This picture here is of an archaeological dig in Mud Bay, the same area where that very, very first photograph of the indigenous harvester came from. They're looking at a basket that was preserved in the mud 800 years ago. They found several of these baskets and were able to very carefully extract them from the mud after all this time. These are made of all natural materials, no plastic in here, just cedar bark, cedar roots, and other natural materials that turned out were incredibly long lasting. I know a lot of this because as working on this book, I met this gentleman. This is Ed Carrier, and Ed is a Suquamish tribal elder, and he's also a basket weaver. He learned how to weave baskets when he was quite young, maybe a 5-year-old, from his grandmother, who taught him the traditional method, like you'll see here, of weaving these baskets to hold things like, in this case, Olympia oysters. Now, I would say that Ed is just this last year was given the National Endowment for the Arts Award. He is a national artist, recognized for 80 some years of participation in this field, and certainly a very deserved recipient of that award. It turns out that we like to think that, well, we kind of tend to think that Native Americans harvested whatever was available on the shores. But in actuality, they've learned more recently through archaeology that people improved the tidelands. They actually built, like you can see in this picture, right along the tree line, big piles of rocks that were actually put there to meter out the fresh water that would join the salt water. This is actually up in British Columbia, so the Salish Sea, and freshwater creeks would flow in and create great conditions if they were managed properly for oysters. As it turns out, they also put things like old beat up canoes, felled logs, other things into this tideland to hold the water and create sort of like what we would call dikes today. It's become a very popular activity. These are tribal people from all walks of life, and they're all working together to build another one of these, what we'd call a shellfish garden. By passing rocks, it's sort of like a bucket brigade. From one rock goes to the next person, to the next person, and so on. And they were able to build up a wall to create a shellfish garden. So we're now learning that there's a lot more thought going into raising clams and oysters and other shellfish than we had given the Native Americans credit in the early days. Of course, all this changed with the gold rush of the 1840s. This is a kind of a political cartoon showing a gold seeker during the California gold rush of the 1840s. And he has everything he needs, or he thinks he needs, for striking it rich in the gold fields of Sutter's Creek in that area of California. And the next picture I'm going to show is sort of startling. This is actually a painting of the San Francisco Bay waterfront in the 1840s. As you can see, there are no big high rises. Off to the right, you're basically seeing wooden buildings. I think there's a 3-story building in there, but none of those big, you know, the skyscrapers that we now think synonymous with San Francisco. But what we also see on the left, all those ships at anchor, they've all come from the East Coast, around the Cape, all the way back up the coast to San Francisco to drop off gold seekers. A lot of those people had great aspirations for finding gold. Not that many did in reality, but just enough to keep things populated and popular. So lots of people were out there celebrating, and I would have to say oysters have always been sort of a celebratory, special occasion food. It's not something you just reach into the back of your refrigerator and see if there's ever any oysters in there. It's more likely to be something that you have as a toast to celebrate, or maybe with a little champagne. So people were delighted when they found there were all these oysters in San Francisco Bay free for the taking, kind of something they weren't used to on the East Coast. And people like Mark Twain, for example, this is young Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, when he was a young reporter in San Francisco writing for a newspaper. And he was the one who actually came up with this term, heaven on the half shell. That's because he was staying at a hotel that had almost the equivalent of a happy hour, you know, free oysters for anyone who's staying as our guests. And like every other author I've ever met, he was a lean and hungry fellow. So the idea of free oysters for the taking was his idea of heaven. I kind of agree with him. I'd like that too. Now, the way things worked back then, oysters themselves, the natural Olympia oysters, grow in clumps like this. So they're not individuals like you would see today for sale at an oyster bar or a seafood restaurant. What they would do is go out in boats, and they had these very long-handled, they're hinged rakes, oyster rakes that were for reaching down into the water, pulling up clusters of those oysters and putting them on these little boats called bateaux. They originally were from Louisiana, hence the French name for those boats. Once they had their boat full of oysters, and you can see there's quite a few in this picture, there's a guy way in the back you can see who's starting to pull up another batch of oysters there. But after they got enough to go bring it to shore, they would actually go to a shucking plant. That's what this is. And people were not meticulous about opening these oysters. These are very small oysters, by the way. And actually, they're more likely to be using things like screwdrivers or hammers or anything that they can bust open the shells. So the meticulous oyster shucking that we enjoy today is really more or less a more recent innovation, as opposed to what was going on in the good old days. The only problem with all this was they were not planting new oysters. They basically were taking out, they were extracting oysters, but without replenishing them. And at some point, a few years into the gold rush, they started running out of oysters in San Francisco Bay. People were freaking out, like, what are we going to do now that we can't get oysters out of the bay? And they started sending expeditions out to find new sources for Olympia oysters. They went as far as Mazatlan, Mexico, to the south. And then eventually they started looking to the north. And I'm happy to say that's when they discovered Shoalwater Bay. That's what we now call Willapa Bay in Washington State, just north of the Columbia River. And that was an area that was full of these beautiful oysters. We know most of this because of this gentleman, James Swan. He was an employee of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He lived in Boston originally, came out west to study the tribes and record their ways. And he actually wrote a book about 6 years of life in Shoalwater Bay. That's very interesting because it was a time when there were very few European settlers, and the Native Americans were suffering from the diseases that were unintentionally carried into that area by those folks from the East Coast. So I think in Swan's book, he talks about 4 different funerals of chiefs who died from these different smallpox and different diseases that they had no immunity to. But also Swan gave a very candid and interesting picture of what life was like in Willapa Bay, Shoalwater Bay back then. The illustrations from there are priceless. This is actually a beautiful line drawing that's showing at low tide that people in boats like these are the native dugouts again. And if you look closely, you'll see rowing are mostly native tribal members. The guy standing up with a hat, that's probably the boss, and he's a European who's in charge of, when the tide goes out, get out there and harvest as many of the oysters as you can. So again, this is not really farming. This is extractive harvesting of what was the resource that was already there. Farming was to come much, much later. At any rate, in the same book, Swan talks about the home of Captain Russell. And that's this beautiful house right in the center of this drawing. Captain Russell was the first person, according to Swan, to actually bring a shipload of oysters from Willapa Bay down to San Francisco Bay. And in the book, Swan says, this person, Russell, deserves a statue in his honor for this feat of saving the day for oyster lovers in San Francisco. He says he should have a statue made of oyster shells. I think it's a great idea. Someone should do that nowadays. And off to the right, by the way, while we're on this picture, is a much smaller house in the far right corner. That's Chief Toke's house. If you've ever been to Tokeland in the Willapa Bay area, that's a town that's named after Chief Toke. And there's actually the oldest hotel in Washington, the Tokeland Hotel. I'm actually delighted to say I'm going there just for a couple of days of vacation because it has a wonderful restaurant and worth going to just in itself. But at any rate, getting back to the topic of oysters again, the Olympia oysters remained the main staple. In fact, there's a story that says that the state capital, Olympia, got its was chosen to be the state capital because of a series of oyster feeds that they hosted in Olympia to get people warmed up to the idea of making Olympia the capital of our state. So they had a very significant impact in our own history. It turns out that the oysters themselves, the native oysters, are really important for building habitat. That's what we're seeing here is a low tide, and that crab is actually quite small. For that matter, so are the oysters compared to what we're used to seeing. But all those little cracks and crevices and crannies that are created by the oysters growing on top of themselves are great habitats for small fish and saltwater invertebrates, and they're an important part of our shoreline habitats. So it's kind of tragic that we have less of them now than we did way back when there were entire reefs of these oysters. But there are people, I'll show this next picture. This is Betsy Peabody. She's from the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And her group actually goes and finds areas where they can reintroduce the native oysters into the shorelines throughout Washington, Puget Sound and elsewhere. And that's actually making a big difference in the health of our waters. So we're happy about that. Okay, I'm going to shift over to another oyster. This is an eastern oyster, much larger than the Olympia and much meatier. It's actually one of my favorite oysters to eat, but these actually come from the East Coast originally. And as soon as they built they drove the Golden Spike and connected the railway system to go all the way across the United States, they started bringing eastern oysters in barrels on these railroad trains. And as you'll see here, then offloading them and putting them on the boats, like the Bay Point here, and releasing the oysters into the water. So everyone was happy. Now they had the oyster they were familiar with from the East Coast. It's a real delicacy, and also was fairly easy to obtain. I will say there were problems with this, though, because the oysters themselves did not do that well in the colder and less saline water than what they were used to on the East Coast. Unfortunate. So I have what I call oyster abelia. I collect things like can labels and cans themselves. I have a shipping box from the good old days. When I look at the Seal Rock Oysters can, I can recognize that right away. That's an Eastern oyster. It's not what we're going to see next, the Japanese Pacific oyster, and it's definitely not an Olympia oyster. So this can label actually came from San Francisco, where they were also introducing the oysters, but they were very slow growing. It took about almost 5 years to go from a young oyster to one that was the size to harvest. Kind of a slow return if you're waiting for money from your investment. This picture, also one of my favorite pieces of oyster abelia. This is actually a receipt for some people who are buying oysters. And if you look closely, you'll see the number on the far left, 3, 10, 13, 18, and so on. That's the date. On those certain dates, the 3rd, for example, someone bought 200 Eastern oysters and for $5. If you can find 200 of anything oysters for $5, please call me after this program and tell me where to go, because that's quite the deal. Also, right at the very bottom, you can see 2 shucking knives for sale, 89 cents. So money was a different thing back then, for sure. But the Eastern oyster was very popular. Unfortunately, it was difficult to keep the stocks going. People were always looking for what's the next big thing. I'm happy to say they did find the next big thing. But along the way, they created some damage by bringing these oysters from the East Coast and dumping them into West Coast waters. This is an oyster drill. It's actually from the Atlantic Ocean and was brought in probably in those same barrels along with the oysters. These things actually are quite small. They attach to the oyster shells. They drill holes into them, and then they inject a poison to kill the oyster, and they actually suck the meat out almost with like a straw. They're having like an oyster milkshake, if you will. This was not wanted. People accidentally introduced them. People are still waging war with these oyster drills, even though the eastern oysters did not do that well. The other thing that they used a lot in those days, this non-native cordgrass, it's called Spartina, and that was used as packing material inside those barrels. So when they opened the barrels, seeds would blow out and get spread out around Willapa Bay. They didn't have any natural enemies to these plants, and they started turning the coastline into these marshes of saltgrass, non-native saltgrass. Fortunately, since I wrote the first book, they've actually developed ways of controlling this cordgrass, Spartina, so it's not nearly the issue it was 20 years ago. We have other things to worry about. But I was going to say the real advantage was people eventually got onto the Pacific oyster, another imported oyster, this time from Japan. And this is an old receipt from 1905. If you could read Japanese, you could see that they're basically buying a quantity of Pacific oysters, importing them into Washington State. This was kind of news to a lot of us because we think of that those imports as taking place in the 1920s. So 1905 was quite early. It turns out what they were doing was they were buying adult Pacific oysters, putting them on the decks of ships, doing their best to keep them nice and watered down with salt water during this long excursion. And by the time they actually planted them in Washington, around Bellingham, for example, the oysters were not in good shape, and most of the earliest ones did not live to tell about it. As it turns out, the oysters had baby oysters growing on the shells. And while the adult oysters died, what they realized was the little baby oysters were still alive on these shells. And that started a whole new industry of importing baby oyster seed, is what they call that, of little oysters growing on little bits of shell. Of course, the earliest experts in growing oysters were people from Japan. This is a picture of in Willapa Bay, but it's showing Japanese employees of an oyster company, and they're holding strings of oyster shells. This is a nice word called culch. If you're ever stuck with the wrong letters in the Scrabble game, think of that one, culch, because that's a legitimate word here. And it's basically those, by putting those strings of oyster shells into the water, any of the free swimming larvae of the oysters would attach to those shells, and that would improve the chances of having more oysters. The Japanese knew this. It was all news to the Europeans who were not actively harvesting, but Japanese culture goes back hundreds of years to early civilization in Japan. Just so I can refresh everyone, I had to crib this picture from another book, but it's showing at the very bottom of this circle, adult oysters all in a clump like this. They're actually releasing at some point, usually in the spring and summer months, they release eggs and sperm into the water. This is called broadcast spawning. Kind of a wild expression, but basically there's no parental involvement here. Let's just release these, and fate would have it they'll meet up in the water. And actually, if you start now at the top with what's called a veliger, that's a larval oyster. Eventually, they actually develop shells we're following around clockwise to 1 o'clock. And then you can see spat at about, what would that be, 3 o'clock. The early spat actually settle on the bottom, and that's how the new oysters are launched into our waters. Way to go. It works. So this method turned out to be so popular that people started importing oyster seed in giant quantities. This is a whole shipload of boxes. Each one of those boxes has thousands of oyster seed in them. And several different oyster growers would actually pool their money and buy a whole cargo of oysters and then divvy them up and start sprinkling them on the tidelands and starting whole new crops of oysters. It worked really well. Of course, there's a catch to this. When I worked on the book, I was amazed that the history of the oyster industry has its ups and downs. Everyone gets excited about Eastern oysters, except they're not growing fast enough. Everyone got excited about importing oysters from Japan, except there was World War II, and there was suddenly no commerce with the Japanese whatsoever. I do want to go back, though, a little bit and say that this is one of my favorite pictures in that book, Heaven on the Half Shell. And it actually shows the dapper gentleman on the left is Masahide Yamashita. He was actually living in Seattle. He was from Japan. He had great contacts in Japan, and he arranged a lot of those early transactions of getting people to buy oysters from farmers in Japan. The little boy on the right is his son. That's Jerry Yamashita. He was around until just a few years ago. He was 90 years old when he passed away. So he was one of the earlier oyster farmers and actually was able to survive internment during World War II. He was taken off his property and denied access to the tidelands. And after World War II, when he came back to his tidelands, their oysters had already been harvested. So he basically had to start from scratch. Despite this hardship, he was one of the friendliest and kindest and gentler people I ever met. I would call him an ambassador to Puget Sound. If you met Jerry as an older person, you're a lucky person because he was, like I said, the ambassador of goodwill for Puget Sound. Here's Jerry now, well, most recently in his 90s. Good guy. Okay, now around the earliest days of the oyster industry, we were fortunate. This is a picture of Trevor Kincaid. He's a gentleman who started the biology program at the University of Washington, and he started the state laboratory for oyster studies. So now people really had a chance to know how to do it right, to not just harvest without planting new oysters, to keep things going, how to control the other predators, starfish, ducks, all the stuff that like to eat oysters. All this knowledge came through the University of Washington and Trevor Kincaid's lab. This is what it looked like during the heyday of the oyster industry. These are all growing on basically on the bottom. And as you'll see in a few slides down, it's not something we do so much today, but well, look at all those oysters. It's as far as his eyes can see. This is Hood Canal, by the way. Interesting picture from way back when. The oyster industry stopped being a Japanese-run industry after World War II. And a lot of people who are willing to work hard for not very much money came in. You can see here those little boats that we saw earlier in this slideshow have turned into big giant barges. This is the result of 2 days of harvesting oysters from those beds at low tide. I always joke, by the way, this gentleman on the right, he must be the boss in this picture because he's the least muddy of all those guys. Everyone else has been working hard gathering oysters, putting them in plastic baskets, and then putting them onto the boat, which would get moved out when the tide came back in. It's great in industry. It was one of the few times when we actually had more oysters than we needed. And that's when canning of oysters and canneries started becoming a big thing, even to supply the troops during World War II. Okay, of course, those days are behind us now. And actually, if you went out to look at, well, this is Hama Hama Oyster Company on Hood Canal, a wonderful place to stop and buy some oysters and eat them right there. What we would call tide to table experience. And this person is at low tide at night. In the wintertime, the low tides are at night. You probably know this. In the summertime, it's daytime tides, I think starting around now. And these are all oysters that are being grown in bags, which keeps them off of the bottom. So it's better for the habitat that they're not dredging like the old-fashioned way of getting all the oysters out. They're actually floating in the water, but they're also in bags, so they're out of reach of everything, the sea stars and oyster drills and so on. It's a very effective way to go. The technology has gotten so sophisticated that even in areas like this is off of Vancouver Island, in an area called Deep Cove. Here's another great word for you. This is called a flupsy. Now that's an acronym. You can't use it in Scrabble, sorry. But a flupsy stands for a floating upwelling system. And in this case, it's solar powered. That's why all those solar cells are up here. But underneath in the water itself are almost like little Ferris wheels that turn around and expose the small oysters to the best water with the most plankton, which is what the oysters are eating. So it's giving them a head start in growing well. It's kind of like if you're growing tomatoes out here and you get a head start by growing them in a greenhouse and then moving them outside. After these reach a certain height, a certain size rather, they're actually taken out of the flupsy and put onto the in bags or wherever on the beaches for culturing. This works great, by the way, in Deep Cove where the water is so deep. You normally would not find the oysters at a range where we could actually get them. This technology led to another kind of oyster. This is a flipped, also known as a tumbled oyster. And these are actually Pacific oysters like we've been seeing before. But you know, they're raised in a bag, and the bag itself is either manually or tidally flipped. It's like basically polishing gems, the way that, you know, put rocks in a tumbler, and that's why they call them tumbled oysters. You get these really beautiful shells without all this other stuff, barnacles and other encrusting life on them. It polishes the shells, and it also creates what we would know as a deeper cup, more meat, in other words, in each one of those oysters. I know this is hard to comprehend without seeing this next picture, so let's jump to it. These are all tidally flipped bags filled with oysters. And you know, there's little weights, little floats on the end of each bag. So when the tide comes in, it flips the bag manually up. And then when the tide comes back, goes back out, it lowers them very gently back. The oysters all tumble through the bag and knock off all those little encrusting growths. That's how they produce them. It's a great way to go. I also want to point out, this is actually from Chelsea Farms in Olympia. And this is one of the owners of Chelsea Farms, Sheena Wisaki. There's been a real interest in oyster farming among women, kind of a new trend, because this used to be, as you saw in those early pictures, man's work. And women are now taking over. Sheena Wisaki's father was an oyster farmer, and he left the business to her. As you'll see, this is not that uncommon. There are now, that I know of, 5 major oyster companies owned by women. And those companies, they call the group of 5 women the Oyster Divas. I just love that name, Oyster Divas. because it used to be man's country, but now it's open to women as well. Of course, this was true during World War II, when most of the men were overseas fighting in World War II, and women suddenly started working these hatcheries. So, excuse me, the shucking plants, not hatcheries, the shucking plants. So you can see these are people opening the oysters, and then they put them in cans and would ship them overseas or wherever domestically. It was a good way to go. And really, when women started becoming involved in the industry. I just love this picture, by the way. This is from Oyster House called Dan and Louie's Oyster House. It's in Portland, Oregon. It's actually the oldest Oregon, one of the oldest family-owned restaurants in all of Portland. And man, look at the size of the wait staff there. It's all women, of course, in those days. I would say, though, the contributions of women to the oyster industry is not so much in the shucking plants or in restaurants nowadays, but it also includes experts who have been studying this technology. This is a woman at Hamma Hamma Oyster plant, and she's actually in their hatchery. So those large PVC containers are full of baby oysters. That's basically how they get their starts in these hatcheries before they're either put in a flupsy or just put out into the beaches areas and grown into adulthood. So women have a pretty mixed and varied role throughout this industry. Okay, my favorite story of all this, because here's a woman who is quite connected to the oyster industry in Willapa Bay. This is Annie Harold. She's actually a multi-generational oyster farmer. A lot of people have inherited these businesses going back 100 years, and they still have rights to the properties that are raising the oysters, which gives them kind of a leg up. Nowadays, it's really difficult to individually own shoreline property. For most cases, it's actually owned by the state, so we all have access to that. But way back, going to the days of the Eastern oysters, people started getting private ownership of oyster farms. And if we follow Annie Harold's history, her company, by the way, is called Chetlow Harbor Shellfish in Willapa Bay. It's worth a visit of itself. But going back to the days of her great-grandfather, Roy Harold, that's him. He's probably growing Eastern oysters in this picture, because this goes way back to the Tokeland Oyster Company, and then later to the Ilwaco Oyster Company starting in the 1920s. Now, her great-grandfather was, of course, the father of her grandfather. And this is a nice picture of grandfather Harlan Harold. And you might recognize those boxes in this picture, the ones that are on the deck of this boat. These are those same oyster seed boxes that we saw in large quantities earlier on. So he's definitely in the business of farming oysters, and good things. So now we're into grandfather Harlan, but even wilder, his son, John, is in this picture. And yes, that little baby is Annie Harold in this picture. So her kids are now involved in the oyster industry, making the total of 5 generations of oyster farmers, all within the Harold family. I was really glad to connect up with them. I always talk about how being a writer, I get to meet really interesting people. The basket weaver, from the Suquamish tribe being one of them, but also the individual oyster growers. I felt like I was working on a family album of the oyster industry. And sometimes I'll have people come up to me and say, you know, that picture on page 82, that's my grandfather. So I'm excited about actually connecting up with the industry itself. And I get to eat all the oysters I want. Who can ask for more than that? Okay, the book itself carries lots of different recipes, new ones and old ones. This is an oyster stew recipe that we have included as among, I believe, 20 some recipes. Some of them are quite fancy. Most of them are fairly easy to do, and they kind of reflect the periods we're talking about. So when we get into the discussion of the Japanese culture, there's a lot of Japanese and Asian recipes. Uh, People buy the book, quite frankly, just for the recipes themselves. They were all developed by one of my co-authors who collected them from other chefs from around the region. So I have to tip my oyster hat here to Marianne Wagner, who was the author of that. There also are pairings for the kinds of wines to serve with oysters, and those accompany each of the recipes. Here's another early recipe. This is one that actually comes from that whole area around Squim Bay. And this is smoked oysters, in this case, smoked with lavender. So you can do this in on your outdoor barbecue or in your own oven this way. It's a nice way to go because the oysters, when they're barbecued like this, actually open. You don't have to fight like I do to shuck them and reveal the oyster itself to eat. The lavender is a nice way of giving it that extra smoky flavor. And the Pacific oysters that are here in this picture are introduced the same way that lavender has been introduced to the Olympic Peninsula in more recent times. Now, I also like this because it's a throwback to the earliest methods of cooking oysters. That's what this picture is showing. Native Americans would they dig a pit on the beach, put some fairly large rocks in it, build a fire, and then when the fire burned down, the rocks, of course, are now very hot. They'd put oysters into this and then layer it with seaweed on top to hold the moisture in and let the oysters cook. Then they could move all that off and basically have a feast. So I like the old ways. We have that recipe in the book itself if you want to just do what our forebears did here in the Northwest. This is a good way to get started. You don't have to be an oyster shucking champion like some of the people who I've worked with in this book. All right, I started out by thanking you all for protecting water quality. And I need to tell you, well, way back when the fight was with industry, paper mills, for example, in the area around Shelton, they were creating a lot of pollution that flowed out of the mills through big pipes. Well, nowadays it's less of that's actually under control. We want to protect our water quality. So it's not so much a problem of controlling what comes out of pipes as much as what washes into the water from our land through a lot of our thoughtless activities. And unfortunately, that includes pet waste. If you're walking your dog and you're not cleaning up, and that water happens to wash into an oyster bed, that's not a good thing. Same thing is true with how you change the oil for your car, or for that matter, how your tires or brake linings wear down. So the water that flows off of a highway, for example, and into a storm drain, if it doesn't go into a treatment plant, it's basically going into our own Puget Sound and coastal waters, and we don't want that. So a lot of these little individual actions, how we choose to use garden chemicals, do we use lots of fertilizer or do we use more natural ways? These are all individual choices that really make a giant difference. Every year there's a report about the state of the sound. I believe it's every 2 years, excuse me, I misspoke that. So every 2 years there's a report about how's our Puget Sound doing. And they actually count the number of oyster beds that have reopened since they've been taking more trouble to keep these areas clean, making sure there isn't a lot of agricultural waste that gets into the waters. And that's actually become a winning trend for people in Puget Sound and watching our resources and Hood Canal, of course, to make sure that they're clean. And we seem to be doing our act. So if you're doing it, good for you. I applaud you. I salute you for keeping our resources great. And if you love to eat shellfish, you definitely want to make sure that we're doing our parts. Okay, last picture, and then I want to turn the floor over to those with questions. I'm hoping Karina will be our moderator for that part. So last picture, another one of my great pieces of oyster abelia, the smiling oyster. And I love that these are fresh, frozen Pacific oysters. Sounds kind of like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? I also had someone tell me, hey, that looks a lot like Planter's Peanut, the guy from Planter's Peanuts. But I'm waiting for someone to adopt this image and make t-shirts with the smiling oyster on it. I think that's a great piece of old art, probably from the late 40s or early 1950s. It's hard to find these things. That's why I like sharing them. And sometime I'll give you a whole show of just my collection of can labels. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being patient. And I'm going to turn off my share so that we can move on to your questions.
While you do that, David, I want to say I would be happy to watch a presentation about oyster can labels. So sign me up.
All right. Hang on a moment. I'm just looking where oh, here we go. There. All
There
right.
you are. Hello.
Hello again.
All right. We have had a few questions put into the chat. A couple were about transportation of those oysters, those long distances by rail and ship. What was done to preserve them during transport? How long did it typically take from far away, but also from San Francisco? Any
Yeah,
information you have on that?
I would say sailing from Willapa Bay to San Francisco is probably a day and a half or a 2-day journey. So that was feasible. In fact, those same ships would come back with timber to help build the houses. Like if you go to the Tokeland Hotel, you'll see redwood that's been brought from California and brought up to be used in buildings like the Tokeland Hotel. So back and forth, there was like a regular trade going on. Now, journeys from Japan were much longer. That might be a 4 or 5 day journey of continuous steaming. And there was a lot of effort to keep the oysters alive before they figured out it was about packing the seed in little sacks and just keeping them moist. So a lot of the oysters did not make it on those journeys. Same was true with barrels of oysters from the East Coast, no matter how they tried to keep that all covered in seawater. It was a hit or a miss kind of an operation, although apparently the hit far outweighed the miss. But it was a complicated process. Nowadays, we even have a thing where we send oyster seed when it's quite small and send it to Hawaii for, I jokingly say it's Hawaiian vacation. But the oysters are sent there to grow fast. They actually grow in a warm water outflow on the islands of Hawaii, and they get a head start with their growing, and then they are sent back to the Northwest so they can be returned to colder, nutrient-rich waters that they're familiar with, and that's where they grow to adulthood. So we've gotten very sophisticated in the ways that we transport oysters.
Another comment is about as the state checks the water for red tide PSP, are they checking soon enough? Or is it a little too late?
You know, we have a really sophisticated system that's all done through the Department of Health in the state of Washington. Now, this is talking about oysters that are grown on oyster farms. So if you went to a seafood supplier or a grocery store and bought live oysters in the shell, those have all been inspected. They actually carry tags, not the individual oysters, but the sacks of oysters that show the history of where they were raised. You can actually ask to see these. So how long have they been out of the water and so on. Some people actually in stores put them in live wells of seawater and let them grow that way. But those oysters have all been carefully monitored by the Department of Health on a regular basis. Where we run into problems is when you get at low tide and you go out to a beach, Titlow Beach, for example, and you go, oh, I think I'll just start harvesting my own oysters. Well, those have not been tested, both for red tides, so-called red tides. I believe the term now is harmful algal blooms because the tides themselves are not red. That's a misnomer. But that can cause sickness and even kill people. Some of the earliest victims of red tides were in Captain Vancouver's crew way back when in the 1700s, who were eating shellfish, mussels in this case, without checking to see if they were safe. And people got very sick, and I believe 2 people died from that. So I'm not a big fan of, unless you've really checked ahead of time to make sure these are safe to harvest and eat. You can go online and find the answer to that. But anything that comes from a shellfish farm is 99.5 whatever percent safe to eat. So that's my style. I like that. All right, thank you.
I have another comment from a participant who said, wonderful talk. Thank you. What are your thoughts about paralytic shellfish poisoning? The increased occurrence in wildland areas, anything other than outside, out of watershed, water quality control? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, these different paralytic shellfish poisoning, or just as bad, but maybe not lethal, diuretic shellfish poisoning. These are basically little planktonic free swimming organisms in the water that doesn't harm the oysters, they eat them. It harms us when we eat them, and they've been eating those planktons, algae in this case. Unfortunately, we don't really have that great a track on whether the incidence of the red tides is increasing and how it's related to land use and pollution and other things like that, or for that matter, global warming. We don't really have long-term enough studies to definitively put the finger on, aha, that's what it is. Just a guess. So we will know more about that as life progresses. Currently, there's a lot of debate over ocean acidification. That's also a relatively new thing. That it turns out that our oceans, as the climate warms up a little bit, it's changing just minutely, but enough to make a difference. What the pH or the salinity, excuse me, not the salinity, the pH, the chemistry of the water is changing, and it's becoming more acidic. It's actually dissolving the shells of very small shellfish. So it's not a good thing. They're finally figuring out a lot of it has to do with the currents that come from deep ocean upwelling. It's a fancy word, but basically undersea volcanoes are constantly putting sulfur and other minerals into our waters. And if you start pulling that water into a hatchery, it does not do well for the baby shellfish. So now they're going, well, we need to turn off the intakes for a little while and wait till the water changes. They've at least gotten that far to figure out some solutions. It's still farming. There's a lot of uncertainty in that.
I have another comment. Thank you for an excellent presentation. And then this is an interesting question because I was thinking about this a little bit. It is interesting that some people feel oysters are okay for vegans because there's no central nervous system. Do you have thoughts on that? What do you have a stance on that, David?
You know what? You're talking to the man who wrote the book about eating bugs. So, but I would say this, you're absolutely right. You know, there's no big brain in an oyster. There's a central nervous system that's like a ring of 6 nerve cells, 6 ganglia that pretty much calls the shots. So they're way lower on the food chain. I would also say they're raised in such ways now when you look at monitoring of seafood and they figure out which ones are most sustainable. Oysters are always in the top bunch of sustainable seafood compared to things like salmon, for example, which are either wild or they're farm raised. But there's a lot of iffiness about how sustainable that is, certainly compared to oysters. So I say if you're willing to give it a little bit of a stretch of the definition of vegan, I would go ahead and eat oysters. A life is a life. That's what I've been taught. So whether it's a carrot or a cow. Thank you.
Good point. Another question, do you know, has anyone tried to culture oysters to produce pearls in Puget Sound?
You know, pearls are something that all oysters can produce. Um, but the ones that we think are lustrous and beautiful are usually artificially produced in culture. These are cultured pearls. Sounds fancy. But actually what they do is they put a small, almost like a bead inside the oyster, and oysters secrete a lustrous coating on that, what would normally be an irritant, a grain of sand, for example. And that's what creates the basic pearl. Now, whether that's a beautiful pearl like we like, or whether it's a weirdly shaped pearl, like you would get, I've talked to people who have like little, you know, those little tins, metal, like mint tins. I've seen whole collections of oysters, pearls that have been collected by shuckers. Now, the pearls themselves are not lustrous or desirable. They're not even round. They're weird shaped. So they are producing pearls, but whether we want to make jewelry out of them or just keep them as oddities is another story. Even those giant tridacna clams, the ones you see in movies, they can produce like golf ball sized pearls, but they're basically like pieces of chalk. They're not lustrous or valuable at all. Shucks. So thank you for asking.
A lot of posts of appreciation, enjoying your photos, found it most interesting. One person said, as a senior native Washingtonian, I love learning more about my state, and I did today. So
Oh,
thank
great.
you. Does
Great.
anyone else have a question they would like to ask David while we have him here with us?
Actually, I'm going to ask my own question
Oh,
here
good.
because it's not in the book, but people ask me what didn't make it into your book because it's pretty exhaustive when you read it. Um, my mother told me a story. I grew up in Chicago, so this is all hypothetical from when I was a little kid. I probably was like a 4-year-old, and she told me a story that was kind of popular maybe at that time about an oyster who was in love with another oyster and wanted to make a beautiful pearl and give it to the oyster as a sign of affection. Well, when he produced the oyster, the shell, the pearl, there we go. When he produced the pearl, the female oyster said, "Well, I don't want that. What I'd really want is a square cut emerald." And of course, the male oyster was shocked. Well, how am I going to do that? But he tried and he tried and he tried. Remember, this is a kid's story. He tried and he tried, and eventually he was actually able to produce a square cut emerald, which he conveyed to his sweetheart. But at that point, his sweetheart had gone from being a female oyster to a male oyster, because sometimes the oysters will change sex as they age. So the deal was off at that point. And I'm just amazed that my mother thought that this was a story to tell a 4-year-old. I mean, what was the point here? I'm only guessing it was like a Bennett Cerf wise, witty story that was going around at that time. But I remembered it and wrote it down. Didn't get into the book, but now I'm sharing with you. So thank you all very much.
Well, we have a few more things popping up here. Talking about children's stories, one participant read a children's book about oyster gardens, and we've noticed you using the term farming. Is there a difference between farming and gardening, or is it just a more poetic choice for the children's
You
book?
know, I would say it's for, well, farming is a good way to go because it is a form of aquaculture, ocean farming, if you will. But the gardens, shellfish gardens, is a term that they're using a lot now for Native American efforts because they weren't nearly as rigorous in terms of having everything in orderly rows and all, but they literally improved the shoreline to make it easier to harvest. And this was important way back when because some of the earliest harvesters were senior citizens. They were tribal elders. And getting them access to easy sources of food was an important, what do they say, food sovereignty. That was an important step. So I really value that perspective. And it's nice to see that that's coming back. Even in Hawaii, among Hawaiian natives, they're starting to create shellfish gardens there.
Well, now we've had a couple questions that have turned down the science avenue.
All right.
One is zinc present in higher levels in oysters than other shellfish? And then
You
the
know what?
other, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I have to jump on that one right away because the oysters do have really high levels of zinc. And when they study people, most people are a little zinc deficient. We just don't eat enough in our regular diets. Well, way back when, I'm talking like medieval times, people were really deficient in zinc. And if they ate oysters, they would get literally a zing from the zinc that was in those oysters. And that's what led to this reputation of oysters being an aphrodisiac. You know, eat these oysters and now you're ready to go. That was the plan. And that was because of zinc deficiency. An interesting observation.
Well, the other science question is how many chromosomes do oysters have?
Somebody in your audience is definitely aware of the world of oyster farming because normally oysters would have two chromosome pairs. They have lots of chromosomes, but they're in pairs of two. Except when they start manipulating the growing practices, this started, by the way, a long time ago in the summertime, they would have what's called shellfish mortality. And oysters, for some unknown reason, would die a lot during the summertime. Somebody figured out, well, if the reason that they were dying is because they were already weakened from producing eggs and sperm. It was kind of like they were spawned out at that time, more susceptible to whatever it was that was killing them. So they actually invented an oyster, which was nicknamed a sexless oyster. It didn't reproduce. And it had three sets of chromosomes instead of two. That would be called a triploid oyster. So how did they get more of them? Well, it was either by exposing them to certain chemicals or pressuring treatments, but they could create triploid oysters in those hatcheries. And then if they say that something like 80 or 90% of all the oysters we buy in jars that have been shucked, so we're just buying oyster meat, those are most likely triploid oysters that are around all year, not just during the winter months and fall months, but also during summer when normally you wouldn't have oysters available. It's a good invention.
Ooh, here's a question about for those of us that have oyster gardens, should we raise some Olympia oysters to get spawn in the waters, hoping some will reintroduce locally?
You know, Olympia, that's a great idea, and I think if you have a good habitat, that's where these people from Puget Sound would be helpful to contact because they understand the intricacies of what counts as a good Olympia oyster habitat. If you have a habitat for that, sometimes you can buy Olympia oyster seed. I think maybe it's like once or twice a year that they're offered for sale outside of the shellfish farms. And you would definitely be doing the world a favor by encouraging Olympia oysters to grow in your areas where you have access to that. So great. Let's take one more question
Okay,
and
yes.
then I'm spawned out.
All right.
All right.
First I'll share a great little clarification that a participant provided. Farmers raise produce, ranchers raise protein. So
Oh, well, there you go.
there's a case made for that these are oyster ranches.
Mm,
I kind of like the imagery of that. The
I
last
like that
question,
clarification.
yes, the last question is asking what you think is the best way to grow oysters. This is from the patron who labels himself as an oyster rancher over in Grapeview, and he uses trays. And we're curious to hear what you think.
Oh yeah, trays are also good, in particularly if they're suspended off the bottom, so they're in mid-water. They're still getting lots of protein, lots of plankton rather, but not having to worry about a duck diving down and eating them. So that's a really good way to go for sure. I like the whole idea of putting them in these plastic mesh bags that you saw in the photographs, because that does block out a lot of predators from eating the oysters, but it also keeps the oysters off the bottom. And you know, nowadays we're very sensitive to things like the bottom growing plants, eelgrass, which are important for keeping the water chemistry healthy. And a lot of animals, including ducks and geese, eat the eelgrass. So for obliterating that through our ranching techniques, that's not a good thing. But keeping them off the bottom is encouraging the eelgrass to grow and the oysters to grow as well. It's a win-win situation. All right.
Well,
Thank you for
thank you,
asking that.
David. And I want to let everybody know, in case your mouth has been watering ever since David started, the library does have a copy of the Eat a Bug cookbook. So
All right.
it can be yours for
That's
3
good to know.
weeks. Yes. And the Sasquatch. I think we have 7 of your titles in the collection. So
That's
lots for
good.
everyone to dive into if you want to find out more about other areas. Thank you so much, David, for
Hey,
being here
thank you
with
so
us.
much for hosting. This is wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much. This was wonderful.
Right.
Thanks, everyone. Everyone have a lovely evening and watch for that email. And if you can take just a few minutes to complete that survey for Humanities Washington, that would be great. So on behalf of all of us, thank you, David, and thank you to the Friends of Swim Library who helped make this program possible. And thanks to all of you for being with us. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Good
You
night,
too.
everyone.
Thank you. Good night.